So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. We are back to look at the longest talk by Dan Biddle I've ever seen. We're not even close to done, but in the last episode, Dan basically said the fact that dinosaur fossils exist in only parts of North America, and that rock arches that could not have formed in a flood exist, is together compelling evidence for Noah's flood. He also gave one of the stupidest strawmen of science I've ever seen outside of Flat Earth, in saying that the scientific consensus is that the Chicxulub impact event killed all the dinosaurs that ever got fossilized, even the ones from the Triassic and the Jurassic and the early Cretaceous. You know, animals who lived over the course of some 170 million years or so. Now he's going to tell us all about kinds, which are a group of organisms that share common ancestry with each other, but not with any other organisms. Of course, science would say that by that definition, all known organisms fall into the same kind, but let's hear what Biddle has to say on the matter.
Some really smart biologists have studied this field. It's called baraminology.
They may be smart, but that's not really a good thing in this context, because when it comes to stuff like Flat Earth, creationism, 9/11 truthers, and ancient aliens, the smarter the people doing the conspiracy nonsense, the harder it is to attribute their actions to ignorance rather than malice. But also, the name baraminology is a Frankenstein's monster of bad linguistics. The composite morphemes are bara, min, and ology. Bara is from the Hebrew bara, meaning he created. Min is from Hebrew min, meaning kind, and ology is from Greek logos, meaning word or study in modern use. So it's supposed to be the study of created kinds, but that's not what the phrase bara means in Hebrew? The default word order in Hebrew is verb, subject, object. So while in English you would say the dog bit the man, in Hebrew the order would be bit the dog the man. Now Hebrew finite verbs are marked for the person, gender, and number of the subject. So like in Spanish, the subject does not always need to be a separate word. This creates ambiguity though. Using the Hebrew word order, one could say bit the man. Does this mean that the man did the biting? Or that the man was bit by an unstated subject marked by the verb form? Hebrew resolves this with a little particle et, which is placed before the direct object of the sentence to clarify the syntactic role of a noun. Et is called in English the direct object marker, because linguists don't always use arcane names for everything. So bara et min would mean he created a kind, but barat means a kind created, and also normally you can't use the word mean without another noun, and the inseparable prepositional prefix le, like a kind of something, but we're just going to ignore that for now. Notice that at no point does this mean created kind. I'm no Hebraist, but if I give it my best go, which I'm sure will be corrected in the comments when I invariably get it wrong, I'd say a better translation might be like min boret. A perhaps better name for the pseudoscience might be min borology, but that's just because I at least tried to puzzle out some Hebrew. Creationists don't even care.
It comes from the Hebrew word bara, which means to create.
Still no, that's not the root. That's the conjugated form of the third-person masculine singular past tense form of the verb, which is generally the simplest and lexical form of the verb. The root is bet resh aleph, and in the infinitive form, that is, to create, it's livro. Please forgive my poor pronunciation.
And mean, which means kind or family.
Mean in no way means family, it just means kind or sort, a generic grouping of similar things with no particularly firm meaning. The exact meaning depending on context, just like the English gloss. The word for family is mishpocha, but the reason he's saying family is not because he thinks that this is the word that would describe a group of closely related kin, but because he wants to connect it to the taxonomic rank family. The idea of a biological family was basically invented by Pierre Magnon in 1689, who applied the Latin word familia to various groups of plants. Later, Carolus Linnaeus would adopt the term as one of his 9 taxonomic ranks. Of course, the problem is that even in the days of Magnon and Linnaeus, the biological groups called a family had no particular definition. It's just a collection of organisms that taxonomists agree pass the vibe check to be called a family. That's literally it. It's completely arbitrary, as are all taxonomic ranks above species. So Biddle is trying to not too subtly retroject a concept that wouldn't be invented until the 17th century, back into the text of Genesis from the period of the Babylonian exile or so, about events that never happened. Even if young Earth creationism were broadly true, this would be absolute nonsense.
So baraminology. And it's really easy to see how you could fit all the different animals on the ark when you start spidering back the tree, the animal family trees.
Yeah, you come back to just one animal, the common ancestor of all animals. That is, unless you decide to stop at some arbitrary point because further common ancestry makes you feel uncomfortable.
So for example, Canis lupus, which is the wolf kind.
That's a species, so I guess now a kind is at the species level. Suddenly, it's not so easy to see how Noah could fit all those animals on the ark. Needing a pair of every terrestrial animal is a lot of animals. And even if we say that the ark was a TARDIS with only 8 humans, there's absolutely no way those animals could all be fed, watered, and mucked sufficiently to keep them alive for a whole year.
There's 339 dog breeds that all go back to a wolf.
That's true.
Now, when you selectively breed a beautiful wolf down into a dumb basset hound, you can't get back to a wolf.
You never left wolf. Dogs are wolves. But also, what is with this insulting small dogs among creationists? Are creationists compensating for something by only liking big dogs? But it's also not clear what point he's trying to make. You could certainly never with just basset hounds recover the genome of a wild wolf, but you could with the help of mutations get something that physically and behaviorally resembles one. It would probably take thousands of years, though.
But my mom loves basset hounds. She's on to 6 of them.
I guess she doesn't have to compensate for anything with only respecting dogs of husky size or larger.
So, but you can't go backwards, but they all come from the original kind of the wolf.
Well, he really does seem to be doubling down on the wolf Canis lupus being a kind. So I guess coyotes, Canis latrans, are a separate kind? So now we can't even use breeding compatibility to see if things are in the same kind, because when wolves and coyotes breed, they produce fertile hybrids.
Interestingly, if you take a wolf's paw in Alaska and you bury it in liquid nitrogen, you can't freeze it.
Excuse me, the did you just say?
The boiling point of nitrogen is negative 195.8 degrees Celsius, or minus 320.4 degrees Fahrenheit. So liquid nitrogen must be that cold, or colder. It will freeze any biological substance that comes in contact with it in less than a second. It's one of the only reliable ways to get amorphous ice here on Earth. It will absolutely freeze a wolf paw, and I can't find a single source talking about this. Near as I can tell, Dan just made this up.
It's a perfect design. It can go below minus 32 degrees.
Well, that's true, but it needs to go below minus 320 degrees. That's a lot colder.
Because it's got so much circulation and movement and blood flow in its paw, it can't be frozen.
Arctic wolves live in the Arctic, as you'll probably not be surprised to hear. The coldest temperature ever recorded in the Arctic was minus 69.6 degrees Celsius, and that was measured in the middle of Greenland on an ice floe. Arctic wolves live around the coasts where it is warmer. Liquid nitrogen at its warmest is 126.2 degrees Celsius colder. I don't care how much blood flows through a wolf, that won't help. You know what happens to blood in liquid nitrogen? It freezes solid in a fraction of a second. I have seen firsthand how quickly any water-based solution freezes in liquid nitrogen. It's essentially instantaneous. Even my favorite kill from my least favorite Friday the 13th movie doesn't really cover how fast liquid nitrogen freezes things. And yes, it's the kill where Jason shoves the scientist's head into the liquid nitrogen, then smashes it into frozen bits on the desk in Jason X. I can't imagine why he's telling this very obvious lie.
Amazing design with these wolves.
So amazing, he had to lie about it.
But if we start looking at that, we can boil down all the dog kinds back, or varieties back to a wolf.
Right, but no one disagrees with this. Pointing out that evolution is correct to conclude that all dogs share common ancestry with wolves isn't something that can help us decide between science and creationism, because we both agree.
Same thing with bears.
So now the kind is at the family level. Well, at least he's inconsistent.
In the Ursidae family of bears, there's 5 different species that are still interfertile.
Well, that doesn't mean anything. Wolves can breed outside of their kind, according to what Biddle has been saying, so breeding means nothing when it comes to determining kinds. Also, of course, not all bears can interbreed, so even if we were to say that that was how we delimit kinds, then not all bears are the same kind. On the other hand, since human sperm can in fact fertilize hamster eggs, which then go on to divide, humans can breed with hamsters. So if breeding means the same kind, humans are the same kind as hamsters.
You can breed a polar bear with a grizzly bear with a black bear. They're all the same kind. Chickens, same thing.
Oh, and now with chickens, we're back to a single species. What is going on here? Oh, right. Dan doesn't know what any of these words mean. He has no clue what he's talking about, even on his own terms.
68 different breeds of chicken. They're all still interfertile.
They're all the same species, so yeah, I'm not sure what the point is of pointing out that members of the same species can breed with each other. That's kind of the point of being the same species.
And even horses, 336 breeds of horses.
Once again, the kind is at the species level. So let's see, when it comes to groundfowl, odd-toed ungulates, and canids, the kind is at the species level and has nothing to do with reproduction. When it comes to bears, though, it's at the family level, and breeding does have something to do with it, except that not all bears can interbreed, so it actually doesn't matter even there. It sure seems like kinds are whatever Dan says they are, and that there are no objective criteria. Almost like kind is a nonsense concept invented by creationists post hoc to accommodate the fact that the story of Noah's Ark is impossible if taken at face value.
And even today, you can take the smallest horse and a Clydesdale, and you can still breed them. They're the same interfertile kind.
Better make sure the Clydesdale is the mother on that one, or you'll just get a dead miniature horse.
So when you walk that all the way back to the originals, you only need about 3,000 pairs or varieties of animals to go on the Ark.
Could it possibly be more obvious that that's the number he needs, so that's the number he gets to? This is not a sober scientific attempt to determine anything real about biology. This is nakedly an attempt to justify an absurd belief in the historical reality of the Noah story. Dan does not believe in kinds because he thinks there is solid evidence for them. He does it because he has to. He has decided that an obviously ahistorical story is in fact real, and he will do whatever mental gymnastics he needs to make it seem at least not completely impossible.
So here's what happened. We had a landmass, some people call it Rodinia or Pangaea.
Rodinia and Pangaea are not the same supercontinent. You can't just say some people call it Pangaea, some people call it Rodinia. Supercontinents are discovered by linking the geology of continents across modern oceans and vast distances. For example, the Appalachian Mountains, the Atlas Mountains, and the Scottish Highlands all have identical geology and can be fit together to form the remnants of a single gigantic mountain chain that formed when Pangaea came together. Similarly, it is the geology of other places that shows us that before Pangaea there was an earlier supercontinent, Rodinia. Rodinia is so old that even the plates were not what we know them to be now. You can't simply conflate these supercontinents, they're very different. Once again, this just drives home the degree to which none of this is about the evidence. The evidence couldn't possibly mean less to Dan. It's at worst an obstacle to be avoided or overcome, and at best something he can cherry-pick from while ignoring anything that isn't useful.
And when all of the fountains of the great deep broke open, here's what it looked like.
Well, that's the breakup of Pangaea, not Rodinia, so I don't know why he even bothered mentioning Rodinia. But also, we know that fault lines aren't fountains. They don't trap big reservoirs of water. Big reservoirs of water below the crust aren't even really physically possible. Further, if the continents moved from a Pangaea configuration to the modern configuration during a year or so long flood, it would require so much heat that it would boil off all the oceans several times over. Noah wouldn't be hanging out in a boat, he'd be steamed like a dim sum dumpling in the Ark. Remember, the reason that the plates move is that they are pushed along by the mantle, so they can't really move faster than the mantle, and how fast the mantle moves depends on how fast it can flow, and how fast it can flow depends on its temperature. Dan has more in common at this point with a kid making up a silly story than a scientist looking at evidence and drawing conclusions.
We actually believe that the majority of these movements happened during the flood, during the 371-day process. So,
meaning that this is what would happen to Noah. I feel like he's not even going to acknowledge the heat problem.
when it happened, there was a lot of subduction going on.
That's putting it mildly. Too bad, though, that a lot of this volcanism has been preserved in subaerial ash layers, meaning that the ash was deposited in the open air, not in the water. So, that precludes it being produced during a global flood.
That created volcanism along the continental margins that were spewing up ash. This is why the dinosaurs are buried in ash layers.
If only the ash was submarine, that wouldn't have really helped, but at least it wouldn't have been so preclusionary. Instead, we can in fact preclude the flood. But furthermore, almost no dinosaurs are actually buried in directly deposited ash. That was for a long time the general consensus on the Yixian Formation in China, which is the only formation with lots of dinosaurs that seem to be mostly in ash. Now, the competing hypotheses are that the ash was reworked in a fluvial environment, or that most of the preservation is a result of things like burrow collapse. Really, at this point, I'm curious which dinosaurs he means in particular.
Because of the subduction-related things that were going on. In fact, if you look at the Independence Dike Swarm, which is a system of volcanoes over here, it blew enough ash over here that you could fill New Jersey 740 meters with ash. That whole area right there is a big pile of ash that came from California.
Okay, so before I talk about this, I want to talk about flat Earth. Don't worry, there's a reason and it connects to what Biddle is doing. My audience has a lot of overlap with the audiences of Flat Earth debunkers like MC Toon and Craig McNeil, both of whom I've collaborated with in the past, so they'll probably get where I'm going. When it is pointed out to Flat Earthers that if they believe that the way time zones work is that the sun is above the disk of the Earth, circling above it, and only lighting those areas near it, then the sun cannot ever go below the horizon, and yet it does so every day, they generally retreat to saying that that's just perspective. The problem is that when we apply the law of perspective to their idea of a sun above the flat disk of the Earth, we find that it is in fact still impossible for the sun to ever dip below the horizon. Sure, it might go so far away that you can't see it through the atmosphere, but it can't ever actually sink below the horizon. Also, it will be pointed out that if that's what the sun did, then it would change significantly in angular size throughout the day. Again, the answer tends to just be the one word, perspective, even though the whole problem is that perspective says that we couldn't see what we see if the Earth worked the way that flurfs say it does. Basically, flurfs use perspective to explain phenomena that perspective, as it is understood by basically everyone, can't actually explain within their framework. If the flurfs want to say that perspective works in ways that are heretofore unknown, it's on them to actually do experiments to show that this even can happen. Until then, these explanations make no sense. Similarly, creationists will do the same thing with sedimentation. They will suggest that sedimentation during the flood happened in ways that, as far as anyone can tell, are physically impossible. It's up to them to do the experiments to show that, in fact, sedimentation during a high-energy catastrophic flood can actually simulate things like subaerial ash, fluvial sandstone, lacustrine shale, etc. Until they actually can do this, there is no reason to take them seriously. Okay, now we can actually talk about what he's putting on screen during his presentation. So the ash from the Independence Dike Swarm is found in the Morrison Formation, but it's not a pile of ash. The ash is actually included in relatively low amounts in most of the formation, and is especially in abundance in the Brushy Basin member, but almost none of the rock, even in the Brushy Basin member, gets the 25% or so threshold that counts as even tufaceous, although some of it does get as high as 50%. But further, we have to note that ash travels much more slowly through water than through air, and even in air it's pretty slow, falling like snow, not like rain. So it's hard to see how ash from California could reach Colorado during a global flood. It likely can't, and the only real explanation for this is that the ash was airborne, which means that both the Independence Dike Swarm and the Morrison Formation formed when neither was underwater. So yeah, once again the actual evidence on the ground argues against a global flood, and if Biddle wants to show that it's even compatible with such a flood, never mind indicative of such an event, he has to do what no creationist ever does. Actually show how this is even physically possible in ways that others can reproduce. Of course, he's not going to do that, because this fundamentally isn't about what's true, it's about his dogmatic anti-science propaganda.
This is secular speak. These are secular geologists that have uncovered these things.
Yeah, because creationists tend not to actually do science. Creationism has contributed nothing to human knowledge. It's as useful as flat Earth is to real scientists.
We just disagree on the timeline.
Yes, the scientists have a timeline based on rigorous reproducible measurements. Creationists have a timeline based on the speculation of an Irish bishop, based on an ancient text that contains genealogies that aren't even likely intended to be taken literally.
So that when it starts receding like that?
When what starts receding? The flood? The ash? What are we talking about here? I'm so confused, and I didn't cut out any of his talk here.
It's going to fill it all with what's called, geologists call that gulf the Whopper Sand.
The Whopper Sand. That's a Paleogene pyroclastic flow in the Gulf of Mexico. What does this have to do with the ash in the Morrison Formation from the Independence Dike Swarm? The source of the ash in the Whopper Sand is known, and it's much later volcanism from north of the Gulf, not from the Independence Dike Swarm. It's true that the exact way it was deposited isn't well known, but that seems to largely be a result of it not being well studied. There are very few peer-reviewed sources I can find on the Whopper Sands, and it seems like most of the work on it is by oil company-funded researchers who really are only looking at the geology in an effort to find more oil and gas deposits in the Gulf. Well, I guess we'll see what point Dan makes.
It's like thousands of feet deep with sediment runoff that came as it washed off. So you can see the channelized cuts would have done that.
I mean, it did flow into the Gulf. I have no idea what point he's trying to make, though. This is a completely different set of ash deposits. I don't even know what the argument is supposed to be.
Now we can even zoom in to the continental margins on the California coast here, and we can see the runoff margins. Here's Monterey Bay. We'll spend more time on this later.
Yeah, coasts are where erosion hits the water, so of course there are erosional features at the coast. What reason do we have to think that these features are flood runoff? The bare presence of erosional features doesn't help creationism, because science also says that there should be erosional features. What about these particular features are incompatible with the scientific explanation and indicative of a flood in particular? Nothing that I know of, and Biddle hasn't suggested anything.
Look at Monterey Bay. It's a huge submarine canyon that stretches as long as the Grand Canyon, and we have these continental shelves all over the place that are filled with runoff.
Yeah, that's what sediment does. It runs off. Those are still active channels with actual undersea river-like currents still carving them. What makes them special?
But just look at the Monterey Canyon. It's like I said, it's about the same size as the Grand Canyon. When you invert it, it looks huge. We can zoom in and see it.
A deeply incised canyon with steep walls, tributaries with sharp angles, and with at least a few switchbacks. So a canyon that was not formed in a catastrophic manner, because we know what flooding looks like. Look, here's some flood runoff on freaking Mars. And here are the channeled scablands in Washington, actually confirmed to have been formed by biblical proportion flooding. They don't look like what Dan's showing us. What Dan is doing is the geological equivalent of deciding that because fire is bright and hot, and the sun is bright and hot, that the sun must actually be a really big campfire in the sky. He's going full JM truth.
Boy, was I wrong.
It's an amazing structure. All that came from channelized flow.
I mean, yeah, it is a channel, so it's channelized flow, something that's not unique to flood runoff, but is just, typical of water.
That came off of America at the tail end of the flood and washed down a river the size of the Grand Canyon.
Sounds cool. Too bad everything about this runoff channel indicates it wasn't catastrophically formed, because we know what it would look like if it was catastrophically formed, and it's not that.
So huge sheet flow coming off of the continents like that.
Which would have formed U-shaped straight channels, not V-shaped meandering channels. Okay?
And that's what's going to explain when the water's coming back off of the continents during the erosional stage of the flood. Now let's make a quick comparison of the most famous extra-biblical account about the Epic of Gilgamesh. Has anyone heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh before?
So now we're going to hear an extra-biblical account of the Epic of Gilgamesh. I wonder what the biblical account of the Epic of Gilgamesh is, because I have read the whole Bible and Gilgamesh isn't in there. But for those of you out of the loop, the Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest works of narrative literature known in the world, and it is significantly older than the oldest parts of Genesis. It has also been translated into Klingon, which is the real mark of quality literature. If it hasn't been translated into Klingon, that's a sign that it might not be worth reading.
Okay, interestingly, today in not half but most colleges, it's required learning in English. For most students are going to go through with the Epic of Gilgamesh.
I have a minor that's an interdisciplinary history/English minor and a degree in history. I never went through Gilgamesh in college. Maybe the University of Massachusetts is one of those weird no Gilgamesh schools, but I doubt it. I think Dan is just making stuff up. I don't think this really matters to the whole discussion, but it's just astounding to me that he'll say just anything, whatever comes into his brain. Arctic wolves are immune to cold damage. Everyone learns Gilgamesh. Every canyon is formed by catastrophic runoff. All fossils of dinosaurs have to have been killed in one event. It's like he doesn't even consider the possibility that the intrusive thoughts in his mind might not actually be true and good. In fact, I polled my audience about this, asking them if they went over Gilgamesh during their higher education experience. Here are the results. I had 439 respondents, of whom 57% said no, 21% said yes, and 22% said that they had not had any formal education beyond high school. That means about 250 people said yes and 92 said no. That means that 342 or 343 people who have been to college or university answered my poll. Of those, 73% of them did not learn about Gilgamesh in college or university. That does not seem compatible with the idea that most colleges are teaching Gilgamesh to contradict the Bible. Now, I recognize that my audience is not a representative sample, and this survey wasn't a rigorous test or study. But still, if Biddle was right, we should probably expect more than 20% of my college-educated audience to have been taught Gilgamesh.
I have a suspicion that I think that's probably because what a lot of the professors are doing is they're saying, well, the Epic of Gilgamesh is obviously a fable tale, and therefore the Bible's account of the flood is too.
Okay, he can have that thought. Now he can read the mind of professors that he himself made up. Maybe it's just that he never actually figured out how to distinguish fantasy from reality. This is common among small children. That's why they treat imaginary friends as if they were real. And that's why they can get their feelings hurt during pretend play. Normally, by puberty, humans have figured out how to reliably distinguish between their own imaginings and real life. I think it might explain a lot if Dan cannot do this reliably. It would explain why he thinks any erosion feature is a sign of a flood, why he imagines that everyone knows about Gilgamesh from college, why he thinks he can figure out the motives for professors doing things that they aren't even doing it for the most part. Clearly, something is wrong with his cognitive processes. Now, that may not be some kind of pathology. It could simply be that Dan simply doesn't care about reality, and as a result, doesn't care to distinguish it from whatever random thoughts pop into his head that seem to make sense if you don't think about them, which he never seems to do.
In fact, you'd be surprised at the number of college students that have been indoctrinated to believe that. Well, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Bible's account, there used to be some legend of an old flood. No, not at all.
Yes, there is an old legend of a flood. It predates the Bible. It's in the Epic of Gilgamesh. These are just objective facts. On its own, it doesn't disprove the historicity of the flood of Noah, but it's still true. And yes, it is what we'd expect if the flood story is what we know it to be. A literary creation of the Babylonian exile influenced by flood myths of the Babylonians, which were themselves influenced by the flood myths of the Sumerians. That's not indoctrination. That's just history.
The Epic of Gilgamesh talks about an ark that was about 300 feet square or so and had 7 different levels, and it obviously would have tumbled out at sea.
I mean, good job, later Hebrew author, for making a better boat story. No one that I know of is arguing for the historicity of the flood from Gilgamesh, so I don't know what the point is of saying that it's implausible, which it is.
So we hired a hydrophysics group to simulate what a huge storm would have been using the Beaufort storm scale to compare Noah's Ark based upon the biblical dimensions to the Gilgamesh Ark.
Why? Who cares? Of course the biblical Ark is going to do better. It has more ship-like proportions. But who is disputing this? Does Dan think that if he can prove that other ancient flood stories are even more impossible than his, that makes his not completely impossible? That's not how things work. If I tell you I can use a pogo stick to jump to the moon, and then you give me all the math as to how that's impossible by showing things like how much potential energy my pogo spring can store, and how at maximum it's not even close to enough to get to the moon, I don't get to respond by saying, yeah, well Justin says he can use his pogo stick to go to Mars, which is completely crazy. So my ability to jump to the moon on my pogo stick must therefore be true.
And it's quite obvious, you can see the difference here. So here's the Gilgamesh Ark. It would have been rotating. There's just no way. About 200 feet on each side, 7 stories. Animals can't live through that. But the Ark can go all the way up to level 10 on the Beaufort scale and not capsize. It can turn 45 degrees up on each side.
Just like Dan's mom. I'm sorry, but what am I supposed to say to Dan complaining that someone else's myth is sillier than his myth, as if anyone cared? I'm glad that Noah can beat up Utnapishtim, and that his made-up boat is cooler than Utnapishtim's made-up boat. But just like 2 nerds arguing about whether Iron Man or Batman would win in a fight doesn't make either character real, whether the biblical ark or the Sumerian ark would float better has no bearing on the reality of either.
Perfectly sea-stable for what it did. It was only afloat for 150 days.
Despite the oceans boiling off and the crust of the earth turning to lava under the best conditions for the heat problem that Dan himself brought up with his idea that the continents went from the condition of Pangaea to the modern day in the course of a year. Let's not forget that. If Dan's right about plate tectonics, we wouldn't have liquid water on Earth anymore, and Noah would have been turned into carbon dust by the heat.
Before it parked and then the Earth began drying out and everything. And the Epic of Gilgamesh also has only a 7-day flood.
Ha! My flood is better than your flood. Cool. Doesn't matter though.
Not 371 days. So there's some practical differences between Noah's flood and the Epic of Gilgamesh.
That's true.
Which might matter if you were trying to argue with people who thought that the flood from Gilgamesh was historical, but as far as I can tell, no one thinks that.
So let's look at a key verse in Scripture about the flood, and it's Genesis chapter 11.
That is chapter 7, like it says on the slide. It's verse 11. I think Dan might have a literacy problem.
In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on the same day were all of the fountains of the great deep broken up.
I bet he doesn't bother to talk about the windows of heaven.
The Hebrew for this is baka, is also baka, which means like to cleave.
That's the lexical form of the verb here, but yeah, he's basically right. It means to cleave or break or divide.
Something open with like a meat cleaver. And the windows of heaven were open.
Okay, I was wrong. Interesting.
So there's 2 systems going on that God used to initiate the flood.
Yep, both of which involve a flat disc-like earth with a dome over it that isolates it from the cosmic waters above and below the earth.
Sheet flow, torrential rain from heaven, and the fountains of the great deep breaking open.
We're just going to skip past the fact that floodgates in no way is just a funny way to say clouds. And it's not like this idea is unique to Genesis. Job 38 depicts God storing up hail and snow to drop on the ground. In fact, Job really implies the flat earth, with dawn having a particular place, the seas being shut behind a door, like the doors in the firmament dome, as well as the gates in the deeps of the ocean. This is connected because the people writing these books are part of the same cultural continuity. Biddle doesn't take either the fountains or the floodgates literally. He makes up ideas about them that seem more plausible, but why doesn't he do that about the rest of it? It's just inconsistent. There is no such thing as a biblical literalist.
So the flood started on the ocean floor.
No, it says it started in the sea and in the sky at the same time. He's now just lying about the text. Nothing about this indicates that the windows of heaven were opened at a later time.
That's why when you look at the fossil record, we have the, quote, simple organisms all on the bottom and the sea organisms all on the bottom, because that's where the flood commenced in the first place.
Okay, but we also have marine organisms all through the column, so we can't just use him making up that the flood started in the ocean, combined with ecological zonation, to explain the fossil record. At a very basic level, the fossil record is not ecologically zonated going from bottom to top.
So when it zenith or peaked after about 150 days.
He said, apropos of nothing.
So here's an animation of what it might have looked like when the fountains of the great deep broke open.
And here's an animation of what it might have looked like when Alderaan broke up.
It was a linear rift system. We can still see this rift system all over the planet today.
Except that no, we know what tectonic fault lines are. They aren't gateways into the oceans of the hollow earth. They're full of solid rock and only minor pockets of water, and then only near the actual fault. There were never any physically impossible subterranean oceans, and if Biddle wants to argue otherwise, it's up to him to provide even a single point of evidence in favor of that. So far, he's just asserted it. It's a fine assertion, but he needs to do more than that.
40,000 miles of the linear rift system. It would have created a lot of tsunamis when the fountains of the great deep are breaking up like this, and it would have been pushing water on both sides.
Oh, cool. So he must have some source indicating worldwide temporally correlated tsunami deposits, right? No, that doesn't exist. No one has ever been able to detect these tsunamis in any reproducible way. Oh, weird. It's almost like this never actually happened. And in case you're wondering, tsunamite is rock deposited by a tsunami.
It's creating new seafloor.
He's showing the subduction of oceanic crust under continental crust. That's the destruction of old seafloor, not the creation of new seafloor. That happens at a fault where plates are spreading like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is basically the actual opposite of what he's showing. How is he this dumb? Please, explain it to me in the comments.
It's going to hit the landmass, and as it's diving down, it's going to create cycles of tsunamis and earthquakes that are pushing water up on both sides. It's going to
tsunamis that didn't leave behind a single bit of tsunamite. How convenient.
Subside underneath the continent. It's going to create mountain uplift, which is what we see.
We do see that. That's fair. That's how the Rockies form, subduction of the Pacific Plate under the North American Plate.
But as that seafloor, the newly created seafloor, is being pushed under,
you really can't tell the difference between subduction and seafloor spreading. This is amazing. How does anyone, even a young Earth creationist, take this guy seriously?
It's going to push it up, and as the seafloor cools, it's going to pull the water back off.
What? What is he talking about? So he thinks that hot, new seafloor is being created, then immediately subducting, even though that's not how this works, and there's nowhere on Earth where we have evidence of this happening. But then the seafloor, which is plunging into the even hotter mantle, which is superheated, by the way, because otherwise none of this could happen as rapidly as he needs it to, is cooling somehow, and that is attracting water from the land back into the ocean? By what mechanism? Water doesn't seek cold temperatures. This doesn't even make sense internally. Never mind that there's no physical evidence for this. It's not even logically coherent. What about cooling seafloor that's subducting, which means it should be getting hotter, is attracting water from the land? What's the mechanism for this? This might actually be more insane than thinking that the consensus view is that all dinosaur fossils were killed by a single asteroid. I'm calling it. This has gone past 1,000 millihovens. Even Kent Hovind's stupid idea that despite it violating the laws of physics, that the Earth cooled off when a bunch of cold ice fell on it, is more coherent than this. At least that just violates one law of physics. This isn't even a thought. This is just word salad with cool animations.
So we have these seamounts that are coming up, these linear rifts.
Now we're just conflating rifts with seamounts? Not all seamounts are associated with rifts, although the largest rifts do occur as seamounts. A seamount is just what it sounds like, a mountain underwater.
They're pushing up like this, creating the new seafloor like a conveyor belt that's going over, hitting the landmass, creating tsunamis and all kinds of water that's coming up over the land and everything.
I cannot believe the degree to which he can't even understand the most basic things about plate tectonics. The only major seafloor spreading that is happening on Earth since the breakup of Pangaea is in the middle of the Atlantic along the mid-Atlantic ridge. That new crust formed in the Atlantic doesn't run into the continent. It's part of the continental plates of Africa, Eurasia, North and South America. It pushes those plates away from the middle of the Atlantic. The crust that subducts is on the margin of the Pacific plate in places like Japan, Indonesia, Chile, Alaska, and Washington state. That subduction is why the places I just mentioned are well known for active volcanoes, but places like Portugal, Mali, Massachusetts, and Brazil are not. This is not that complex, and yet Dan can't seem to figure it out.
And then when God said, the Bible says God shut the fountains off at about day 150.
So I guess then you can't say that they're oceanic ridges because those are still going strong. Neat.
When that happened, it would have created cooling, and when you have cooling, it would have shrunk back down, lowering the seafloor, and when you lower the seafloor, it pulls the water back off of the continents.
The height of the crust is not temperature dependent, so no.
It's a perfect mechanism for it.
Yeah, unless you take into account silly things like geology, biology, basic thermodynamics, nuclear physics, etc. Apart from those problems, it's a perfect mechanism.
So the Bible's got this, the science for it all the way down.
That might be the stupidest thing I've ever heard. None of that is in the Bible. None of it. He made that stuff up, read it back into the Bible, and it still doesn't work.
This guy, Dr. John Baumgartner...
Oh good, the creationist crank who came up with the modeling software that, while it is not used in the form he published it because it's too buggy, and who also came up with a flood model that involved him needing to change the thermal qualities of rock by several orders of magnitude. This ought to be fun.
Is probably one of the top 3 leading flood geologists in the world.
It's like being the world's leading serial killer. It's not something to be proud of.
In fact, I went to go see him before we did our first Noah's Flood movie.
I saw that. It was so boring, I didn't even bother responding to it. After this, Dan goes on with a long anecdote about Baumgartner and doesn't make a point with it, except that Baumgartner feels possessive of flood geology. I'm skipping that so that you don't have to waste your time like I did.
And his science resulted in a theory called catastrophic plate tectonics.
It sure did, and that model has a lethal heat problem that will result in an energy release similar to the detonation of tens of atomic bombs per square kilometer per second for the entire duration of the flood, something no creationist has ever addressed except by invoking things that break the laws of physics. Which, okay, but at that point, we're not doing science or caring about evidence, so again, why bother?
That went all across the newswire, and he actually developed a software program called Terra that modeled Pangaea breaking apart to the point that he nailed how fast the continents were spreading, about 5 miles an hour during the flood.
He didn't nail it with some simulation. He designed the simulation to get that result because he was fishing for a simulation of Noah's flood. He had to increase the thermal diffusivity of the rocks of Earth by several orders of magnitude in order to get it to work the way he wanted. Thermal diffusivity is a measure of internal heat transfer rate. Basically, if you put a metal spatula on the burner of your stove, how long until the handle is burning hot as well as the business end that's actually touching the stove? It is defined as the thermal conductivity of the substance divided by the product of its density and the specific heat capacity. Thermal conductivity is much like electrical conductivity, except that it measures how fast heat transfers rather than how well electricity transfers. Density is, as you probably know, simply the mass of an object divided by its volume. And specific heat capacity is the amount of thermal energy needed to increase the temperature of a mass of a specific substance by a particular amount. For example, water has a specific heat capacity of 4.184 joules per gram per Kelvin, meaning that it takes 4.184 joules of energy to increase the temperature of 1 gram of water by a single degree Celsius, or by 1 Kelvin, which is the same change in temperature. Thermal diffusivity is a property of a substance that does not simply vary. Under the same conditions, the same substance will always have the same thermal diffusivity, unless the laws of physics change. Since the laws of physics are what they are, Baumgartner's model is physically impossible based on current scientific understanding. Since he has to know that, being himself a geophysicist, it means that his simulation isn't a discovery, it's a deception. Baumgartner knows what he did. There's no way for him not to. He decided that he has to get to the flood, and he lied to get there. There's no way around this that I can see, and no, the later use of his Terra modeling software with actually realistic parameters by other researchers does nothing to negate this.
So he's got all that science, and he joined with 5 other PhD guys, and they came out with the CPT model, the catastrophic plate tectonics.
Based on how painful this has been, I feel like it should be the CBT model instead of the CPT model.
I'm so sorry, children.
Here's an output from John's program, Terra. He's got the timing and everything else. He'll show you how fast the continents broke apart during the flood, which ones went where, the directions, the speeds, the whole bit, the heats, the pressures that were involved. This is from his model, Terra. He's currently a professor over at Liberty University.
I think the fact that he's associated with that scam of an institution should tell you all you need to know about the credibility of his so-called simulations. You know, if me telling you how he made them wasn't enough. And just to drive home the fact that simulations don't really mean that the thing they're simulating is real, here's a simulation of the Earth being on fire. You might notice that the Earth isn't on fire, at least not literally, at least not yet, although if Cheeto Hitler gets his way, maybe that will change.
But you guys, the flood and the fountains of the Great Deep is actually quite obvious. You can go look on Google Maps and see this stuff. Google Maps, you can see it right here, but it really becomes prevalent and obvious when you look at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge here, and you can see all these perpendicular rifts in these lines that are coming up, and it's actually elevated, and it perfectly matches these two continents back together.
That does nothing to support the flood in particular. That's just the evidence that everyone accepts for plate tectonics and the breakup of Pangaea. That's what the fancy epistemology boys call non-dispositive. It can't help us decide between competing hypotheses because it is expected under multiple hypotheses, including the scientific explanation as well as creationism.
And did you know that they've done oil correlation studies? They've looked at the oil chemistry from oil deposits along this coastal region and this coastal region. And did you know that the 12 different deposits that they investigate, when you put the continents back together, they match perfectly?
I didn't, because I don't know of any such studies, but since those coasts were once together as the interior of Pangaea, it's not surprising to me. That's what I would have predicted. That's the kind of thing that clued us in that there had been a supercontinent in the first place, which I have to reiterate, is the consensus view. He's not arguing against science here. This is what the whole scientific community accepts, and it wasn't something that was discovered by creationists. In fact, they were latecomers to accepting plate tectonics, like they are to all science. Young Earth creationism is a retarding force in science. All it ever does is just hold back public acceptance of new science until it can't anymore. Then it just reforms itself to accommodate the previous science it had always rejected and gaslights its followers into thinking they weren't science deniers on that point up until recently. They've done it with speciation, they've done it with plate tectonics, they've done it with natural selection, Pangaea, and they're starting to do the same with feathered dinosaurs.
So there's all these oil deposits stuck along here, and when you put them back together, whatever flora and fauna died and was buried to make up all those oil deposits,
it's almost entirely flora, but who cares?
Matches back perfectly. And you can look at the fossils, and we have correlated fossils over here that also match the fossils over here.
Yep.
Because the same ecosystem was catastrophically pulled apart, and here's the clue. The animals are found buried in the mud that killed them.
No, they're not, because most of the Paleozoic strata from these areas are from an arid environment, and a lot of it is windborne, because the interior of Pangaea was a vast, dry, hot desert. So the deposits from there are characteristic of desert deposits.
In the mud that was responsible for their death. And the same creatures are found over here that are found over here. It's just the most amazing thing.
This is a lot of effort to convince people that Pangaea is real as if it actually helped young Earth creationism. I wonder what the goal is. Maybe he generally finds creationists to be skeptical of the existence of Pangaea. I don't remember if I believed in Pangaea when I was a creationist. If you were ever or are now a young Earth creationist, let me know in the comments if you accepted or accept that Pangaea was a real place. Of course, he hasn't bothered to tell us that this correlation of the flora and fauna of Pangaea stops in the Mesozoic, which the flood model cannot explain, since it should be preserving only Pangaean ecosystems, since those were the only ones that existed on land up until the flood. So why is the correlation in fossil taxa not seen in the Jurassic and the Cretaceous? Oops, it's almost like biogeography debunks Noah's flood.
Here's another one where you can see all the fountains of the Great Deep, the mid-ocean ridges. It's a 40,000-mile system that covers the Earth 1.6 times around.
Hey, since this isn't anything that supports flood geology over actual geology, and I'm basically torturing myself for y'all who are watching, if you like what I do and can afford it, why not check out my Patreon or join the channel? It's cheap, you can cancel at any time, and you get early access to videos like this, and you can join my exclusive Discord server. Because if I'm going to put myself through this much pain, it sure would be nice to get something out of it. Of course, if you can't afford it, then please don't. Just like and share this video. The algorithm has been rough of late, and any support would go a long way.
And these were literally the fountains of the Great Deep that open up in the flood. You can go look at them yourself. You can go touch God's judgment to the world.
If that were true, Baumgartner wouldn't have had to cheat and break physics to get his results. This whole idea is literally built on a foundation of lies. The lies of one specific man.
So when the lava came up and split, it served as a pushing mechanism to shove these continents apart. As a new seafloor was being created, it's pushing these continents apart. That's the action that's involved.
Finally.
He can be taught!
Yes, it's pushing the continents apart, and it's not subducting. He finally managed to not conflate them. I feel like I should call and congratulate him.
But when the new seafloor is being created, it's going to go over here like a conveyor belt. It's going to build pressure up against the land, and it's going to break and release and push a tsunami up onto land and one out to sea.
Never mind. We're just back to him not realizing that there's no subduction going on in the Atlantic. I was so hopeful. That's the mistake I made. I had hope. I will never have hope again.
And these were happening in cycles, at one after the other, during Noah's flood. And that's why the dinosaurs are buried in layers.
But they're not buried in layers of turbidite, let alone tsunamite. They're buried in layers of all sorts of different rock, mostly not catastrophically deposited rock. You can't just say that this would make layers. The layers it would make are not consistent with the layers that we can find. And once again, has Dan or anyone else figured out how to make tsunamis deposit something that looks like it was deposited over centuries in a lake, including seasonal variations in pollen content in the rocks? No, they haven't. But that's the one thing they would need to do to make this model go from completely impossible to at least not absolutely precluded by the data as it stands. But that's where we are. This is completely precluded. If you have any sedimentary rock near you, no matter where you live, there is an almost 100% chance that some aspect of that rock completely falsifies the idea that it was laid down in a global flood. The evidence against this is as strong and as pervasive as the evidence that the Earth isn't flat. It might not be as obvious, but it's not less real and no less conclusive.
Because the tsunami would come wash up and then wash back. Wash up and wash back. They're buried in all these layers.
Then all the layers should have the same depositional environment. They don't.
So here's some good evidence. When there was a 60-foot seafloor slip in Japan, that sent tsunamis all the way over to the Americas. We all remember that big tsunami that happened in Japan.
It sent waves to the Americas. That's a chart of the wave heights, and by the time it hit the Americas, all the waves are under like a half a meter. I don't think that a wave that's not even a meter tall counts as a tsunami. But hey, at least he's not pretending it's a graph of radiation levels from Fukushima like I saw happening all over Facebook in the immediate aftermath of that event. I'll take a small win after this much suffering.
That was because there was a subduction stuck there left over from the flood. It slipped and released, rebounded about 60 feet, and it caused a tsunami that went over. Imagine that process happening over and over again for a couple hundred days during the flood. That's the mechanism that we're talking about.
Wow, that sounds pretty catastrophic, which is what God was going for, I guess. But, we can tell what happens when you get tsunamis. They leave behind characteristically compressed sediment, chaotic fossils, and often contain large rocks that can become part of the resulting rock. They're also generally graded with larger sediments at the bottom and finer ones at top. We do have fossil sites like that. The Tanis site comes to mind. It was actually made by a tsunami that got to inland North Dakota, which at the time of the end Cretaceous was invaded by a shallow sea. We can tell it's caused by a tsunami because it has debris in it, it was deposited in a direction opposite the flow of the local rivers, it's full of marine freshwater and terrestrial organisms all jumbled up, and it's graded from coarse sand up to fine silt and clay through its 1.3 meter vertical extent. So it's not like scientists don't know what to look for in a tsunami deposit. But we don't find that in most of the fossil-bearing rocks on Earth. In fact, it's almost unheard of, so no, this can't explain the fossil record.
Now, this is the scary part.
Ooh, the horror of creationism.
You guys, we're standing on an ancient book written in Hebrew that says tsunamis were responsible for the flood.
No, it doesn't. It just flatly doesn't. This verse is about the receding waters at the end of the flood. Look it up yourself. Literally nothing in that verse in any English translation I can find, or in the Hebrew, in any way indicates that there was a tsunami. In fact, I asked biblical scholar Kip Davis, and he said that the closest he could come to interpreting Genesis 8:3 in this way is that the steady water decrease was actually steady rising and falling like in tides with a net decrease in water. And that's with him trying to find a way to reconcile this interpretation. In fact, the actual Hebrew says that the decrease was steady or continuous, not that it went back and forth. The going forth in this translation is from the land, and the return is to the sea. This is nothing to do with the water coming back and forth on land. In fact, even this cherry-picked translation doesn't say that. Dan is lying.
Hebrews, or Genesis 8:3 says, "And the water receded from the earth, going forth and returning."
Which still has nothing to do with tsunamis.
And at the end of 150 days, the water decreased.
Which still has nothing to do with tsunamis.
How is it that God's word even talks about the mechanism of the flood that perfectly matches the geology that I just showed you?
Quite easily. It doesn't do any such thing, and the geology was made up, and doesn't actually match the geology that we find in reality. It only matches the geology that Baumgartner made up for the purposes of demonstrating that this event was historical in the first place.
It's amazing God's word even has that.
It would be amazing if it had that. It doesn't, so it's not.
So dinosaurs are buried in thousands of cubic miles of ash.
Wrong.
That's spread across multiple states. Where could such immense volumes of ash come from?
Since they don't exist, nowhere. The ash that does exist does not match this description.
What systems produced it?
None, because again, the ash as described does not exist. What ash does exist came from various sources, mostly associated with volcanism around the Pacific Rim.
And why are the dinosaurs buried in it?
They're not.
So here's what happened when these new seafloors subducting. It's creating these volcanism. It's pushing up all this ash. It's raining down on the dinosaurs. At the same time, the tsunamis are going to be bringing up the sand and the mud.
Weird then how literally no dinosaur fossil site I've ever heard of is characterized as tophaceous tsunamite, which is what would form in the scenario he's suggesting.
Here's the Independence Dyke Swarm. It's a 375-mile linear volcanic rift.
That's true.
Well, it's almost true. It's a system of rifts. That's why it's not the Independence Dyke. It's the Independence Dyke Swarm. The swarm word isn't there just for funsies.
That evolutionists even say pumped 4,000 cubic miles of ash into the atmosphere.
No, they use normal units of volume, not cubic miles, which might be the dumbest unit of volume I've ever heard of. You know, that's also 5,510 quadrillion drams, or 69,900 billion hogsheads, or 2,726,000,000,000 cubic fathoms, or 0.00000000000000000001419 yoctoparsecs. Here in science we use cubic kilometers, cubic meters, or liters most of the time.
And that's what's responsible for burying the dinosaurs in all of this ash.
That they're mostly not buried in, because remember, this ash is really only present in the Morrison Formation, which isn't even all of the Jurassic. So in his model, why isn't Independence Dyke Swarm ash present throughout the Paleozoic and Mesozoic? Instead, it's just in one small part of the Jurassic. His model, if it can be called such, is that the swarm started with the runaway subduction of catastrophic plate tectonics. That means that they started erupting more or less simultaneously with the waves or tsunamis for which there are no evidence. And since they were fueled by runaway subduction, they should have lasted at least through almost all of the rising phase of the flood. That means we should start seeing ash in the lowest flood layers, then it should increase in concentration until at least the Triassic or Jurassic, then taper off during the Cretaceous. And it should be ubiquitous from the bottom of the Grand Canyon sedimentary rocks all the way to the top of the Cretaceous rocks in Colorado. This is assuming a KPG flood boundary, which is the most common one cited by young Earth creationists. Instead, we see this ash in just the Morrison Formation. So this doesn't work at all. And we can tell if it's the same ash because different volcanic systems have different chemistry. So you can just check to see if the volcanic ash is from one source or not. The chemistry of ash is like a fingerprint of the volcano it came from.
You can see there's a huge ash deposit right here.
That's the brushy basin member of the Morrison Formation, which is the most ashy part of the formation as far as I'm aware. It's actually not an ash deposit. It's made up of banded shales, thin limestone deposits, conglomerates, and sandstones, which are generally lower than 25% ash, although some deposits contain much more ash. But hey, that's just according to the United States Geological Survey, the organization in charge of keeping the most detailed records possible on the geology of the former United States for purposes of preservation and economic development. What do they know? Well, they know that the brushy basin member isn't tough, which is what an ash deposit would be.
Evolutionists even admit it came from the linear rift right here in California, just a little bit northeast from us is where it starts. It goes all the way up. It blows this ash of 4,000 cubic miles of it all over America.
I hate the word admit here. Scientists are the ones who discover that, and there's nothing to admit. Nothing about science has trouble accommodating a dike swarm in the Jurassic. What's next? Will scientists admit that lead is dense, that the sun is made of plasma, or that spontaneous nuclear decay rates are not subject to change from pressure outside the pressures found in a neutron star?
And here's how much that volume is. And this cube right down here, this little tiny cube, is Mount St. Helens. So when Mount St. Helens blew up in the 80s, and you couldn't see the sun for 3 days in 3 states with just 1/4 cubic mile of ash, that's what the Independence Dike Swarm did during the flood.
Well, first, so what? Different volcanic events produce different amounts of ash, and dike swarms are associated with supervolcanoes, so they're probably going to produce a lot of ash. And it's not like this dike swarm is unique. But also, we're comparing apples and oranges. The volume there for this Mount St. Helens eruption is for a single eruption. The ash for the Independence Dike Swarm is for a period of millions of years according to science, and at least months according to Dan. This isn't one eruption, it's a series of eruptions, divided by the likely number of eruptions, and it's not an unusual volume of ash. In fact, that accounts for a lot of this so-called decline in ash volume, which I'm sure he'll argue constitutes a decline in volcanic activity after the flood. A lot of the earlier volumes aren't for single eruptions. I'd also like to note that the ash volume for the dike swarm is indeed listed for the brushy basin member, so again, this couldn't be happening for the whole period of the flood. And also, like I said, it's not even tough, unlike the other ash deposits. It's always nice when the creationists put on screen something that confirms what I've been saying.
So that's how you can bury states worth of dinosaurs in ash.
Which his own chart says isn't what happened, but okay.
Because when you go talk to paleontologists who are in the field, they're like, yeah, we come across ash all the time. These dinosaurs are buried in ash.
Any particular paleontologists? Because that's not how they characterize their finds in the actual literature. At least not most of the time. Obviously, there are dinosaurs buried in ash, although it's mostly in China that this is found, not North America. But most dinosaurs are found in non-volcanic sediment.
How did that happen? Well, it came from the Independence Dike Swarm.
Not in the Triassic, most of the Jurassic, or the Cretaceous, which he is just lying about, or he's a colossal moron.
So that's really, I think, what can explain the dinosaur burials. You have to have mechanisms to bring mud, sand, and ash up.
And clay, and silt, and windborne sand, and ash that is subaerial in many cases, not submarine. So, most dinosaur fossils preclude his explanatory mechanism.
And catastrophic plate tectonics really explains it.
Yeah, as long as you ignore the fact that it involves so much heat that even the ash wouldn't survive. Then sure, it explains it. CPT is really like trying to rearrange your furniture by detonating a hydrogen bomb inside your house. Sure, technically I guess that would mean the furniture is no longer arranged as it was before, but it creates so many problems in doing so that it's not really a viable solution. And CPT is the least impossible flood model. The only real competitor is Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, which basically says that if we actually detonated 3 hydrogen bombs in your house, that would be better. Also, he just repeats himself a bit. We don't need to hear him repeat himself, so I cut that bit out.
There's really no other explanation that's a worldwide catastrophe that can better explain how you can fill these dinosaurs in 13 states with mud, sand, and ash. To me, it really fits the best explanation.
But that's only because 1, he's wrong about the most basic aspects of dinosaur taphonomy, and 2, He's looking for a single global catastrophe because that's what he wants to find. So of the evidence that exists, he's going to ignore it if it doesn't fit, cherry pick if it does fit, and make it up if he needs to. He has done all three in this very talk. Also, again, he repeats himself.
It was not related to the Chicxulub asteroid that dropped way down here and buried some dinosaurs over in this region. Something was happening out in the ocean with the subducting plates hitting America, and we know.
Yes, in fact, the Chicxulub impact caused almost no dinosaur facts. Really, the previously mentioned Tennis site is the only fossil site that I'm aware of that has ever been credibly attributed to the impact. Dan is arguing against the most straw-stuffed straw man that has ever been erected against science outside of a flat Earth convention.
We can go see the Farallon plate today with underground radio stuff that they do. It's like a huge X-ray machine, and they can go and see the Farallon plate that actually subducted along the continental margin here. So
that's true.
The repeating tsunamis is what better explains the flood.
Man, if only for that pesky total lack of evidence for any tsunamis apart from one at the end of the Cretaceous, conveniently associated with the Chicxulub impact.
Now, when the receding stage happened, as I mentioned, it's about another 150 days when the water's drying out. It starts in sheet flow, then goes to channelized cuts. Here again, we have the Gulf with what the people call, even secular geologists call it the Whopper sand.
What does that mean? Even secular geologists? First, I'm not aware of too many church-operated geology research centers out there. Second, it's not like creationists usually come up with their own unique names for geological formations. If you ask Andrew Stelling what the names are of the layers of the Grand Canyon, he'll give you the names that are conventional and not coined primarily by flood geologists. He'll say things like the Bright Angel Shale, the Redwall Limestone, and the Coconino Sandstone.
Over 1,000 feet deep. That's from all the erosion that's coming off.
I mean, yeah, it's from erosion, but it's not even of ash layers in the Independence Dike swarm, which is the whole point. Could he be less competent?
And of course, my favorite is Monterey Canyon. My wife and I have stood right there before. It's like a little nozzle of where the water's coming off. You can see it clipped off this huge section of California.
Too bad it's so meandering and deeply and steeply incised, though. That ruins the catastrophic interpretation pretty conclusively unless Dan has some new physics and geology to show us. Which he doesn't. He's never conducted and published the results of a geology experiment in his life.
But it carves out an entire Grand Canyon as it's coming off of America.
In a way characteristic of a long-term process, which is, what we'd expect. And we know what a huge catastrophic drainage channel looks like, and it's not that.
When the fountains of the Great Deep were shut down over here, and it's going to pull that water back off the continent. So
yes, the magical sinking seafloor will pull the water that has been vaporized by the heat of CPT down off the continents. Here's the thing. Absolutely no flood model can explain anything to do with hydrology unless it can account for the bare presence of liquid water, despite the heat generated. You might as well talk about the hydrology of the core of the sun. If you want your model of a watery flood to be one that is even possible, it has to have conditions that would allow liquid water to even exist in the first place. So far, no flood models do. If my model of the solar system involved a sun with the mass of a supermassive black hole, such that its event horizon was many times bigger than the orbit of Pluto, I don't have a good model of the solar system. If a creationist flood model would vaporize not just the water on Earth, but the very crust of the Earth, it's not a good flood model.
Huge area, lots and lots of dirt, and there's an amazing, what they call an alluvial fan out here.
Yeah, they can do that, and alluvial fans are what happens when rivers hit the sea, not flood runoff. They form over a period of meandering by the river, not catastrophic runoff. He clearly doesn't know what that word means.
With all kinds of dirt and debris that were scattered out in the ocean when that retreated off the continent.
An event which would not have formed an alluvial fan. Absolutely amazing.
Okay, guys, so that is my first myth of 6 more that we're going to have. But the other ones go really quick. So why don't we take a break for dessert, and then I'm hoping that you'll find the other 6 myths as interesting as I do this one. So
yes, let's take a break. And I'm sure I'll find them as interesting as the first one, by which I mean I'll be frustrated to no end by Dan Biddle's stupidity. If you enjoy this video, please hit like on this video and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't, and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Van Tovend, Furgevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, Strawberry Vein, Dr. Tapioca Weasel, Elleron Teller, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostek von Mennen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, and Volus. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.